What's good, everybody? It's your boy Big Nate. Welcome back to Big Nate's Book Reviews, home of the best book reviews. And today we are reviewing a very dope book. We are reviewing The Teachings of Don Juan by Carlos Castaneda, a Yaqui way of knowledge. So you already know the drill. I got my doobie right here. What are we gonna do? We're not gonna spark it. We're gonna spark the doobie. And without further ado, let's get into it. So I'm sparking the doobie, as I said. Let me know. And then, of course, we are smoking this for Carlos Castaneda. I should have said that. Excuse me. But yeah, I'm excited. I feel like this is like the first time I've been doing a... Oh, hold up. I forgot to get an ashtray. One second. Okay, doobie has been sparked. What do you know? So, okay, Carlos Castaneda, The Teaching of Don Juan. This book was published in 1968. It was a New York Times bestseller. It sold over 10 million copies in the U.S. alone. And something important to note about this book, you have to forgive me too. I'm a little sick, under the weather. So... but that's not going to stop Big Nate's Book Reviews, home of the best book reviews. Okay, maybe a little bit. It's not going to stop, but it might impinge. But this book was actually published as a piece of nonfiction, and that's going to be very important to remember as we're going through these, because there's some very strange, you could say supernatural things that occurred here in this book. But as I said, it was published as nonfiction. The back of this Penguin re-edition, which I think was like a republication, but you'll notice, you know, we see our boy right there. I found this I think literally in the nonfiction section of the bookstore that I was at. It's something like that. So keep that in mind. And on top of that, it was also published as a work of anthropology, because the premise of this book, which we'll get into in a second here, ended up being the master's thesis for Carlos Castaneda's master's in anthropology. So keep that in mind as we're talking about this book. And then without further ado, let's actually get into what this is even about. So the Teachings of Don Juan. So I'll say essentially what the premise is. The premise is that, like I said, Carlos Castaneda was a master's student, and he was in Arizona, and eventually through his researches he ends up encountering what's basically known as he's called a brujo by the surrounding town people, and I'm talking about Don Juan here. So he's like a brujo, which is basically like a witch, a sorcerer, medicine man, that kind of vibe. And the brujo term specifically is referred to somebody with extraordinary and oftentimes evil powers, right? That's straight from the book. So that's this Don Juan character, right? And eventually he meets up with Don Juan and act like Carlos Castaneda, and they end up, through whatever means, going on a few psychedelic trips together, after which Don Juan takes a serious interest in Carlos Castaneda, and they begin an apprenticeship, and that's basically his time during the apprenticeship, after which, by the way, Carlos Castaneda vowed to give the whole thing up. His experiences were just too intense, and especially towards the end of this book, and I think that's where it gets interesting with the nonfiction, he considered to be, basically downright dangerous. So he vowed. So spoiler alert, turns out there are sequels. I bought this just thinking this was the one-time thing, but eventually, many years later, he does return to Don Juan. So anyway, they begin this apprenticeship where they essentially just take psychedelic drugs, and it's much more than that. We'll get into the specifics of that. It's not like they're just waking up recreationally doing this is very much a intentional sort of spiritual practice by Don Juan as he's apprenticing, like I said, Carlos Castaneda. So one of the big things that I thought was super interesting about this book is, like I said, they're not taking drugs recreationally, because I know that's kind of what it can sound like, but this book is very much a huge part of it is related to the ritualistic aspect, the idea that there's real preparation that takes weeks, months, sometimes even longer, and it involves the actual sort of psychological participation on the part of the person. So for example, for one, just the preparation that goes into it is just crazy. It literally sounds like it's something out of the Three Witches in Macbeth, where it's they're literally grinding live weevils into this paste, and they're putting it in this concoction that's being boiled over a fire, and they're I'm not even shitting you, they're stirring this with bones, right? And then at some point, Don Juan's let me see your hand, bro. Let me see your hand. And then he said, boom, and he just drains his blood into this concoction, and then this whole thing will turn into this black tar that needs to sit out. So, it's this whole process, right? And it already that's crazy, but it gets even crazier, and there's very much, like I said, a spiritual, or I'll at least say symbolic aspect to this, because, for instance, one of the things that takes place is at some point Don Juan pulls up to Carlos Castaneda, and he has a bag, and Carlos was it's kind of moving weird, but it all happened super fast, and Don Juan just whips out a lizard, right? Okay, that's cool. But the lizard, at some point, the Carlos Castaneda realizes the lizard's eyes are literally sewn shut, and then he whips out another wizard. That's crazy. He whips out another lizard, and its mouth is sewn shut. And he's not just doing that for shits and gigs. This is like an actual. There's like a sort of ritual that's thought to be associated with this particular drug, and those lizards end up being sort of spiritual guide. Don Juan himself says the key to this sorcery, because to him, I think honestly the practice of psychedelics and going in what Castaneda ends up calling non-ordinary states of reality. He's constantly referring to it as a sorcery, and it is a sort of magical practice, depending on how you view magic. Anyway, he considers the lizards integral to that, and it's like once you release them right before you do the trip, that's literally like an omen or a direction of how the trip will go, and it's like related to divination. Like you're supposed to ask the lizards a question, right? So all of this is just to say, like there is, like I said, very much a ritualistic aspect to this. This is not just them taking drugs and having trippy perceptual hallucinations. Like, yeah, let's watch a movie, bro. Like this is a intensely, like I said, spiritual practice. So then of course there's also like the actual, like, for lack of a better word, them tripping, and like Carlos Castaneda ends up coining the term non-ordinary states of reality. So one of the first things that happens when he meets Don Juan is like one of the first night or whatever it is, they end up, and again, even this has this whole ritualistic aspect, because it's like Don Juan drives Carlos Castaneda, like without giving him any information, just completely silent. They drive way the fuck out to Timbuktu, where there's like 4 or 5 other, like, again, Yaqui, presumably, I don't know if they're shamans, but like they're all there for that same purpose, and they're not, nobody speaks a word this entire time, but somehow it's as if they're cued and know, like they're all in sync in terms of how the ritual proceeds. And so anyway, that's just like the preamble. So anyway, Carlos Castaneda takes peyote, which is one of the main drugs featured in this book. And of course, it's going to start with like the normal perceptual hallucinations. Like, he talks about his vision becoming absolutely pinpoint clear, like ungodly clear. And then he tries to like say something, and it like ends up, he says it's, it sounds like water coming out of his mouth, like trying to speak. So just, trippy stuff like that. But at one point he ends up on all fours, and he's like drinking out of a dog bowl. But he talks about how he can like literally see the colors of red and green and yellow, all these beautiful hues run like literally coursing through his veins. And then at some point through each pore of his skin, there's like this long fibrous piece of silk that emerges, right? And then he eventually just acquires this beautiful, lustrous mane. And he describes how just throughout this whole thing, he's just filled with this absolutely supreme happiness. Like he literally says that, and indescribable euphoria. And it reaches such a pitch that eventually when he starts to, like come down, he realized at some point, he has this line. He said, I had forgotten that I was a man. Like he had truly forgotten that he was like in contrast with this, like, blissful, enlightened, ecstatic experience, like he comes in, and he said the irreconcilability of such a contrast, it made him weep. He literally begins just after the trip. So again, you see, I keep saying it, but this is not just taking shrooms for fun. This man is literally like weeping on this spiritual experience that he just had, which ultimately kicks off, the rest of the book. And there's one part later too, which is super interesting. And at some point, I guess I'll just preface this now, because this is what it reminds me of. At some point in the book, I realized that the account of his non-ordinary states of reality, of his trips on, again, very large doses of psychedelics, they literally read like lived experience of dreams. And like an example of this is at some point he's in the desert with Don Juan, and they're taking peyote, and eventually he sees like this figure that's like in the middle of the desert, and it ends up being like this entity, like this man that approaches him, and his face is literally just covered in, it's like the surface of a peyote plant. Like his face is the texture of like the actual peyote plant. And eventually like it holds up its hand to him and Carlos Castaneda says, again, this is also very dreamlike, how it like cannot be true, but just somehow it. But it's like this man didn't speak. It was as if anything, like a noise, like flutes, or it has like a certain melody to it, right? And so it's not actual words, but somehow Castaneda says, I somehow knew what the melody was saying was look. And like, so he looks up to the back of his hand, and the back of his hand has a hole in it, right? We're not even going to talk about the crucifixion parallels right there, but this has a hole in it. And he looks in and he sees himself, and he's looking in this hole of the peyote man which is mescalito, which we'll talk about that later. But he sees himself old and feeble and like scrunched over, and these like there's these sparks flying. So again, it's like super dreamlike. And then even just related to that, like, you know, I'll be remiss if I didn't bring up psychoanalysis here, like thinkers like Jung and Freud, where dreams, you know, whether or not you believe it, this is the idea, is that dreams are communications from the unconscious. Whatever sort of secret desires that you don't necessarily like own up to, or repressed memories or feelings. Basically what a dream is a symbolic communication from the unconscious related to those various things. And you can take it, believe it or not, but that's the idea. And that really comes out in this experience that Castaneda has a couple years later, where he encounters the mescalito, right? The peyote man again. And he basically just goes up to him. He starts like begging, like, there's something amiss in my life and I don't know what it is. And he's just asking the peyote plant to help him resolve this psychological turmoil that he has. And then at some point, like, the man becomes his father, or he sees his father who's standing in the middle of the desert peyote plant, right? But then again, very dreamlike. Somehow later, it's just at the same instant, it ends up being his childhood home, and it's his dad. It's him and his dad at his childhood home standing by this fig tree. And he talks about how in the non-ordinary state of reality, he just ends up like spewing, just telling his father all the things that he was remorseful and that he regretted. He ends up just like completely pouring his heart out to his father. And afterwards, again, he's weeping. So it's like this whole, and again, that's very, like, I'm not to go all into it, but just briefly, I'll talk about once my grandpa passed away, and he passed away from dementia, which, you know, if anybody's had that experience, it's like they just sort of gradually lose their mind until eventually, you know, it's not there anymore. They don't remember you. Anyway, the point is, one of the things, I mean, I kind of even understood this more clearly through my dream, but I feel like I never had the opportunity to say like goodbye to my grandpa, you know, like to sit down and have like the heart to heart, knowing that he was gonna be gone, right? But anyway, I remember having this dream, and I end up seeing my grandpa, and I just basically tell him I basically said goodbye to him like how I meant to, but in my dream. And it's like, it's a very analogous thing that happens, you know, in this book. So very psychoanalytic. That's one of the things I really appreciate about this book. Another thing I want to talk about was almost like this mescalito man, right? From the very beginning of the book, what I thought was super interesting is Don Juan refers to like basically he refers to the peyote plant, or like the act of taking the peyote plant, as mescalito, like this capital M, and it's considered by Don Juan to be like this actual entity, right? And at some point after, I think even the first experience that I referenced earlier, and it was such a powerful experience that he began asking Don Juan, like, is mescalito real? Like, is this a real entity? And then Don Juan just like looks at him sort of incredulous, like, what do you mean, you know, is mescalito real? What do you mean? Didn't you experience mescalito last night? And then Carlos Castaneda is like, okay, no, like, put it this way, like, is mescalito someone that I can like, is it an entity that I can physically like talk to? And Don Juan's like, you know, no, of course not. And then Carlos Castaneda is like, well, then how is he able to teach? And he's like, and again, Don Juan is just looking at him just like dumbfounded, just baffled, like, you know, didn't you understand mescalito last night? And this is going to be related to a topic I'm going to bring up shortly. Like, I think what ultimately comes down to like the Western/Eastern conflict of how to understand knowledge. But anyway, another super interesting thing, right? Because this is capital M. There is this question of whether mescalito is an actual entity. And at some point, Carlos Castaneda, during like this ritual where there's dozens of other people and it's like they're all taking peyote, he hears this rumbling which always like precedes the arrival of the peyote man, mescalito, right? So the point is, he hears this rumbling. I'm not even going to talk about, you know, whether it be the Christian conception of God or like, you know, the Greek god Zeus. Always their arrivals are preceded by a rumbling, but we're not even going to talk about that. Mescalito comes down, and that's also important to note because like this rumbling that takes place, it's directly after that Castaneda notices. And again, you got to take this with a grain of salt because bro's on like 14 buttons of peyote, but he notices after that literally everybody else begins to, like, everyone's singing and sort of taking parts in these ritual activities, and they all just perform it like it reaches like this frantic pitch, everybody just as if in response to the rumbling, right? Carlos Castaneda describes how he has like this surge of wisdom that suddenly engulfs him, and he says he realized this idea that he'd been thinking about for three years all of a sudden became clear, that whatever's contained within that cactus, that peyote plant, is an entity that exists out there independently of whether or not, you know, Carlos Castaneda takes the peyote, because that's very much right. When you have a psychedelic trip, you ingest substances which affect your neurochemicals and give rise to this perceptual illusion. But this is a completely different claim, that mescalito is an actual cosmic force and entity that exists independent of and prior to any of our own behavior. This is obviously a very different concept of what psychedelics are and what their purpose is, because to Don Juan and Carlos Castaneda, I think it ends up ultimately being a spiritual activity and experience which leads you ultimately to a mystic sort of enlightenment. And then there's a super important aspect to talk about this book, like basically what I think ultimately comes down to the difference of Western and Eastern cultures and traditions, their different conception of what knowledge is, right? Because basically what happens is throughout this book, Don Juan is Carlos Castaneda is constantly asking all these like logistical questions about Don Juan's rituals and like, what exactly is sorcery and how does it work and this whole idea. And the whole time Don Juan kind of humors him, but at some point he's just like, he just kind of laughs and he's like, you're so totally missing the point right now. Like we can have these conversations, but those are only good insofar as they're a springboard into the actual experience. He basically says it's not only is it pointless, it's like actually stupid to have conversations. And I know that sounds anathema to the Western ear, like, because the whole point of like, Plato's Republic is to have these dialogues. But what it most immediately reminds me of is like some of the spiritual Buddhist literature I've read about like meditation. And what I think that makes it more clear is because throughout the book, they're constantly talking about how like, we can give you tips, we can give you sort of like the philosophical intention behind all this and this, that, and the other. But ultimately you end up just you need to, as the Zazen tradition says, you need to just sit, right? Like there's no replacement for the actual experience itself. So when when Carlos Castaneda is constantly asking Don Juan all these questions about this or that, it's just like, it's pointless to talk about it because you need to actually have the experience itself. And that's like another thing about the nature of knowledge. Like the reason Don Juan basically places so much value on these psychedelic substances is because he says they take you literally beyond what is possible for the human. Like and again, if you've taken any amount of like dose, like even a relatively high dosage of like a psychedelic drug, the characteristic thing about them is you cannot describe it. It is inarticulable, ineffable, and that's because these substances take you basically to a place that you cannot describe unless you have actually experienced it, which is again the whole reason why conversation is pointless. I think there's like a conversation they have that just puts the whole thing perfectly, where there's this one point where Castaneda takes the devil's weed, and it's like basically he describes it, and again this is the fun perceptual stuff, which is all throughout this. Like the bulk of this book is sort of him recounting his experiences and the preparation that goes into it. But he's like stepping, and he feels himself getting taller and taller, and then it feels like he's on stilts, and eventually he just like gets like thrust back and is just like propelled forward, and then he's just flying, and I think if I recall he's like in space or something like that. And he just describes this euphoria and this absolute freedom and being able to control himself while he flied, right? So anyway, that's not even the point. The point is the next day as he's talking to Don Juan, he's like, it seriously felt like I was flying, right? And Don Juan's like, of course you were flying, right? And Castaneda's like, yeah, but did I really fly? Like, did I fly like a bird flies? And Don Juan just again gives him this incredulous look, and he's like, it's like you flew. A bird flies how a bird flies, and a man who takes the devil's weed flies as such, right? And then Castaneda is basically like, okay, let me put it this way. He said, imagine, because again, you can totally just see them talking. He's trying to get at like this objective sort of scientific aspect, and Don Juan is more about the subjective experiential part. So, and then this is why their conversations end up becoming absurd, and like why Don Juan end up just like half the time ends up just laughing at bro. Is he's like, okay, imagine I chain myself to a rock, right? And you watch me, you chain myself, it's a little experiment, a little thought experiment. I'm going to chain myself to this rock and I'm going to take a devil's weed. Like, okay, would I still fly? And again, Don Juan just looks at him baffled, and he's like, I'm afraid if you do that, you're going to have to fly chained to a rock, right? So this whole idea of, so I think it gets boiled down to this, because at some point, Don Juan's like, well, what do you think? Like, you're the one who actually experienced it. What do you think? And Carlos Castaneda is like, I can only tell you how I felt. And Don Juan says, that's all there is in reality, what you felt. And I think that ultimately ends up being like, that puts it perfectly what the difference between Western and Eastern conceptions of knowledge are. So there's, of course, always tons more to talk about, but I'm just going to kind of wrap it up here. So ultimately, I give this book a B+. and I do have a few critiques of it. So the first one I'll just say is, I think at times, I think the preparation of the plants and like the proportions and the instructions that go into it, I think that's cool, but at times it does get over descriptive and tedious. And what this book ends up becoming is basically just like, the preparation for the drug, the actual taking of the drug and his experience. And it becomes a chronicle of that, which is still good, and we still get plenty of insights from him and Don Juan, but I would have liked, I think, what would have put this in A level for sure is if Carlos Castaneda had taken a little more thought into like, basically cultivating the insights and like the larger themes from all of his trips, like basically synthesizing everything in his experience, but ends up just becoming like a report, if that makes sense. But still a super interesting one that's full of insight. And I want to say, I actually only read the first part of this book. There's two parts. There's the Teachings of Don Juan, and then there's basically what ends up being his master's thesis, which is called A Structural Analysis. And I found it so appallingly bad, I could not finish it. I really wanted to. It ends up just becoming a complete abasement of everything Don Juan said. He does what he's been doing the whole book, which is he tries to intellectualize, like the whole goal, and he's talking in very academic, like the purpose of this project, of this study, was to identify a internally coherent, rational, like whatever. It just, like I said, it flies in the face of everything Don Juan has talked about up to till now, and honestly makes me think this really is a nonfiction account and like sort of a reporting. And again, there are some very interesting, frankly supernatural things that take place, particularly kind of towards the end of the book. But again, it is a super important question whether you consider this book to be nonfiction or not. And I honestly don't think Castaneda is creative enough to even come up with that after reading even just part of his master's thesis. So yeah, I think that's more or less all I got to say in terms of critique. I still think it's a great book. And I kind of like having a little hindsight between books when I've read, because I can say now that this is one that I like kind of referred. Don Juan to me is as much a part of mystic literature as anything. So anyway, let me know what your thoughts are, any experiences of your own, etc., etc., etc. Smash that subscribe. Follow me on Instagram at Big Nate's Book Reviews. And thank you once again for watching Big Nate's Book Reviews, home of the best book reviews.